Mark, I know you've been positive on this stock for a very long time, maybe almost back to the IPO. You've had a buy rating on it. That was a smart call for a very long time, but this year has been a different story. What the heck happened, and what you heard yesterday, what do you take out of that? Is that a big dark cloud, or are you still looking for silver linings?
I'm sticking with the buy on it. What I found interesting listening to the call last night is the more that Zuckerberg talked about his investment plans for the metaverse and AI, the more the stock traded off in the aftermarket. The core business, the core advertising business, and it's still 98% advertising revenue, looks like it started to stabilize. If you adjust for currency, you had low single-digit % growth in the June quarter and again in the September quarter and probably again this next quarter. And then as Reels monetization ramps up and engagement continues to rise on the core side and user growth continues to rise and they start recovering some of that lost signal from Apple, you're going to get revenue growth acceleration. And this quarter, I think, was probably the trough margin quarter. So I think fundamentally things get better. The investor question is, can you buy Meta, the stock, if you don't believe in the metaverse? Is that fundamentally disruptive to the investment thesis? And that's a really hard question to answer. I think you can. I think there's a there to the metaverse. I think Meta as a stock is worth more because they invest in the metaverse. Would I prefer that they invest $5 billion? Yes, rather than the 10 to 15 billion that they're spending. But the business is cheap. Their stock is cheap enough that I'm willing to give them a little bit of pass on all that investment spent. But that's really the make or break on the stock. And that's why investors are revolting today. They don't like the metaverse spend.
Yeah, they don't like the name. They don't like the amount of money being spent on it. They don't like the returns they've seen to date or lack of returns, whether that be the audience or what's happening just overall. We talked about this earlier this morning, Mark, and I kind of look at it. I think if Zuckerberg and company were allowed to buy something else, they probably would have. Obviously, that hasn't been the case for a long time. Regulators aren't going to allow them to come in and make another big purchase. So they have to build it themselves. But now you're talking about investment levels that are really getting up there. If it's $9.5 billion or whatever it's been for this year to date so far, I mean, and you're planning on ramping up that spend. I mean, you're talking about numbers that start to look like what it would be for a major acquisition or for the CapEx numbers of something like an AT&T or a Verizon or a Union Pacific. I mean, you're looking more and more like a slow growth company and not necessarily a company that's going to be a really fast growth company.
You're right, Becky. You've set it all up correctly, except, remember, what did we learn about the advertising business today versus yesterday? The advertising business looks like it's stabilized rather than deteriorating. It's actually a little different than Google, but both of these are facing major, if you're in advertising now, these are the dark days. And, at some point, we're going to get beyond this, and it's probably a 12-month outlook. So if you're willing to look out 12 months, revenue growth is almost certainly going to reaccelerate. We think it gets to 20% in the core business, margins rise. That's fundamentally attractive. It gets back to this question about the metaverse. Becky, there is no metaverse acquisition to be done. I mean, Facebook is the leader in this market.
Right, but I mean, if you were making an acquisition, you could say, hey, Instagram is really hot. It's taking off. I want to buy it. This is, I think the metaverse is going to be hot, and maybe we can make something that people will eventually want to go to. That's a different story, too. There's, the risk reward scenario if you're buying something that's already hot versus trying to build something and hope it gets hot.
That's absolutely true. So, they're the leader in a nascent space. And so the question for investors is, if you don't like metaverse, can you buy Meta stock? I think you can. I think the stock's cheap enough to do that. And the core business is, I think, stabilizing. And then that growth in users and engagement, to me, that's the real make or break on the core stock. If engagement is falling and users were falling, you'd run for the hills on Facebook. That's not what's happening. So that's why I'll stick with it. But I get how controversial the investment is in the metaverse. But I think it's a pace or a scale. I think most investors would want them to spend some amount of money. They prefer $5 billion rather than $15 billion.